Hello and welcome to Adventures in Venueland, an EVMC podcast. Join us for this all-access pass backstage and behind the scenes with some of the brightest minds that cross the scope of the live event industry. I'm Dave Rettelberger.
And I'm Paul Hooper. We'll introduce you to incredible guests who journey with us as we dive deep into the world of venues, tours, festivals, and everything in between. Grab your laminate and meet us in Venueland.
Okay, Venuelanders. Okay, Paul, do you think our listeners are Venuelanders or adventurers?
I think they're Venuelanders, but maybe both.
All right. Well, let's just say if you're an arena nerd, have we got something for you, or a venue nerd of any size? Let's talk about a brand new series that we're launching right now. This is called Ancient Venues. And Paul, this was an idea that you came up with.
Yes, I mean, it's very much something, like you said, we are venue nerds. And so I think we maybe don't think enough about some of the roots of this industry, and if we look back at some of these really historic venues, there's terms that we're still using today that were created back then, as well as just designs that we still are seeing in modern stadiums that are built now that may have originated 2,000 years ago. And so I think it's a really fascinating way for us who work and live and breathe in this industry to kind of learn more about the roots of where it came from and these locations and historic sites that are amazing and gorgeous.
So in case this is the first episode you're tuning in for, I'm Dave Rettelberger, along with co-host Paul Hooper. We're going to take you on a different kind of adventure today. Normally, we're talking more about, somebody's personal adventures, but today we're going to talk about ancient venues. And I'm so excited for this episode because if you've ever imagined a trip to Italy and you're a venue person, you got to swing by the Colosseum. But that's not where the history begins. There's so much more to the story, and we're going to tell you all about it today. Paul, would you be so kind as to introduce our guest?
Of course, we are joined by Valerie Higgins, the Associate Professor of Archaeology at the American University in Rome. And we're going to be talking about the Amphitheatre of Capua, which hopefully I said that right. And Valerie, I know we are very much, we don't know what we don't know. And as much as we are venue nerds and we have, Dave and I have kind of done our research and looked at photos online and everything, for someone that's never heard of this amphitheater and the structures around it, as well as, kind of those ruins and stuff in that area, could you give us like a general overview of its history, historical significance, stuff like that?
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I'm pleased you chose Capua because often when people want me to talk about amphitheatres, they automatically focus in on the Colosseum in Rome. And not that the Colosseum isn't wonderful, of course it is, but one of the things I think that's fascinating is it, in one sense, isn't unique. In that there are amphitheatres all over the place in the former Roman Empire. And what makes Capua particularly interesting is this is probably a city that most of your listeners haven't heard of today because it's not one of the big cities in Europe or in Italy today. Yet it has the second biggest amphitheatre in existence after the Colosseum in Rome. It's the next biggest one. So why would it be that what is now a small provincial town, the Romans built this massive amphitheatre, and the one that you see today is the third one on the site? There are two others that were built before.
One goes back to 500 BC, right?
I'm not sure it really goes back quite that far. In Capua, the very earliest amphitheatre was there. It was the end of the 2nd century BCE.
Okay.
Right, so that's the earliest one.
Kind of just imagine that we're not, because when we think about an old venue,
Right.
We might think about, sometimes venues now, they say they're old and outdated after 25 years. And, and then there's some of those classic venues that are, like in Columbus, we have Ohio Stadium just celebrated our 100-year anniversary. And it's got some of those early, Coliseum vibes to it. We're going way back when we're talking ancient venues, and that's why I'm excited about this series is we're talking about the very beginnings of these structures that still impact our industry today. So much of what we see in current arenas was there from the very beginning.
Well, then what happened was from that early beginning, they then built bigger ones later. And in particular, when you start to get into the empire, the amphitheatres become very big indeed. And that's because it's really linked to political power. And that's what makes the amphitheatres makes them a venue that so much is invested in financially, invested in politically, and also very much invested in a type of emotion, shall we say. It's something that comes to dominate the social scene. So amphitheatres, it's really quite hard to overstate how important they were to Roman society. And that's pretty surprising to us, perhaps, because what went on inside an amphitheatre was really pretty grim. There's nothing about the show that went on there that's good.
Yeah.
And so, people have said, well, how is this possible that these people who did so much, achieved so much, how is it possible that this is how they like to spend their time? Why is it that these did become the most popular form of entertainment?
Yeah.
So that's, I think, quite a surprising aspect of amphitheatres, today.
I'm fascinated by the architecture of it too. Surely there were other structures back then. So, I think people, it wasn't like this was the only standing structure, but the scale of this one, of course, as well as the Colosseum. It's just really amazing that they're still standing at all, much less, these big columns and everything. And it's just hard to, looking at current stadiums, it's hard to imagine like the amount of foresight that has to go into planning for, having, Capua, if I'm not mistaken, could have seated around 60,000 people or something like that. That just the amount of planning.
Yeah, I think we normally go a little bit lower than that, maybe 40,000. But still, you're talking about, what would still today be a sizable stadium.
Sure. And the planning around the design of that to be able to like have that many people just come into a venue and exit and support their weight and everything is just really fascinating to me that 2,000 years ago, they had the knowledge and expertise to be able to pull off building something this large.
Yeah. Well, of course, they were much helped by the fact that they had a slave society and they weren't too bothered about health and safety rules.
Sure.
So building it, there was a certain collateral damage which they were prepared to absorb, shall we say.
Yeah.
The thing I suspect that most people don't realize about an amphitheatre is that it's actually built of concrete, because most people don't know that the Romans had concrete. And it was a different kind of concrete to the concrete that we have, but it was definitely recognizable as concrete. And you couldn't have built a building that size without it.
Sure.
You couldn't build it just in stone because the weight would be too much. So the fact they've got concrete is one of the main reasons. And then it's the architecture that's the other main reason, because they kind of specialized in building these vaulted structures. And a vault is actually very, very strong. And you can build big buildings. And then if you put what they call a barrel vault, which is a vault that goes all the way around the amphitheatre, around the whole circumference, it's kind of like a belt holding it all in. And so when you put the seating on it, the seating is pushing outwards, right? But the belt is holding it in. So it's kind of in an equilibrium. And that's how they were able to build such big structures. And they did decorate them very finely. The reason you often don't realize that there's concrete under there is because they've put, as you say, all these columns around the place and decorations and things. But you wouldn't have seen that when you went in Roman time. You wouldn't have seen the concrete when you went in Roman times. You'd have just seen the decorations there.
And there was a lot of marble used as well, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yeah, especially for the most prestigious seating, which was down near the action. And the action, of course, is very important. You know, that's what people go to the amphitheatre for. It's said that it's not, most people describe it, some people have said it's circular, but it's not really. It's what we call elliptical. It's like an oval. And that's actually a very, very good shape, because it gets the most number of people closest to the action. If you made it circular, the people would be furthest away from the action in the center of the arena. But if you make it kind of slightly longitudinal, people are closer to the action. And when you went into an amphitheatre, you sat according to your social class. So if you were wealthy and elite, you sat at the bottom. And sometimes those amazing marble sort of seating that you see, that's almost certainly for the people sitting right next to the arena, who are going to be the very elite people. Some of them even like brought along their own sort of things to sit on, you know, very elaborate furniture and things. So then as you go further away from the arena, you go down in status. And you had to sit according to your legal status, because in the Roman society, everybody had a legal status. It's not a social status. You know, in our society, if you might start off working class and then maybe you get a good job and you kind of get more money and you like move up the social scale. Well, it didn't really happen like that in the same way in the Roman period. A lot of people did move up the social scale, but you had to apply to change your legal status. Wow. And you had to demonstrate that you had all the attributes of this, that you had a certain amount of money, you had land, etc., etc. And then you could change your place at the amphitheatre. But you couldn't just like buy a good ticket and get a good place. So it was an incredibly controlling space, because you had to sit according to your legal status, and you probably never met anyone who was outside of your little group, because even in that there were sort of partitions. So big amphitheatres like Capua and like the Colosseum in Rome, they actually have 80 entrances. And when you got a ticket, and they're numbered, and when you got a ticket, you would go in by your number, and it would lead you through to your bit of the seating. So you never got to really interact with other people. When you went to the amphitheatre, you were quite literally put in your place. You could look around the whole of it and you knew exactly who was considered superior to you, who was considered inferior to you, who was on your level. I mean, there was no doubt about it, you know, very cut and dried.
It feels a bit like that when you go to a show these days and you see those VIP seats on the floor and you think, I don't have that kind of money.
Yeah, that's right. But I mean, that's a choice, you see, that someone can individually make, you know, whether they buy those tickets. You wouldn't have any choice in the Roman period.
Was it seen, despite it really separating everyone and there wasn't any choice, was it still seen as this spot that all these groups were still represented? You know, they're still there attending the same event together. So it was almost this, as much as they're separated out from each other, you still have the poor people and the rich people, and they're all still there seeing the same show. So it's almost like this shared community despite the separation. And I think it's fascinating you mentioned tickets too. Like, were these gladiator battles, were they kind of considered a luxury, or were the common person able to attend? Like, was it a paid event? Do we know?
Well, you might be surprised to learn that they were probably free or practically free.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, because they were paid for by people who were going for elected office.
Sure.
So if you were going for elected office, you were supposed to like give out gifts to people and pay for these games. You could pay for lots of different things in order to get people to vote for you. But definitely the games at the amphitheatre were the most, they were the ones that were going to get you the big votes. So much so that actually in Rome, the emperor didn't want anybody else to put them on in Rome, because that was too risky. Somebody else might become more popular than he was. But out in the provinces, like at Capua, it would be a local family who wanted their sons to go up the social ladder to get all the elected posts, and they would pay for the games at the amphitheatre, and that was what got you the votes. So it was practically free.
You mentioned when people enter the amphitheater, they knew what section to go to. But one of the cool things, right, is that, am I right that there were like, I don't know, would you call it a bust or someone's head above the door, right? A well-known figure, and that's how you would kind of know what section was yours?
I don't know that was true everywhere. They certainly they had like niches on the outside, which had statues in them. And we don't see any of these statues today because they've pretty much all been robbed, But around the outside, there were statues. So I guess they were almost certainly used as identification. But if you look, usually on the keystone above the arch, there's a number. And that would be the number that that would be what your ticket related to, essentially.
I think it's really interesting as we are kind of talking about the design of these stadiums. People listening know all these terms that we might use as commonplace, and we might not realize that they're this old. And ones like vomitorium, and even the word arena, which I think is like rooted from harina, or I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but it's basically like the sand that was in the amphitheater and Colosseum floor that kind of soaked up things. And so I think it's really fascinating that something like a vomitorium, which has these Latin roots and was surely used back in this day, we're still using in, Staples Center or whatever it is, or whatever the arena is. Madison Square Garden, they've got a vomitorium and they're still calling it that. And is that like a good example of just how some of these Roman innovations and things like that have just really trickled down through society many, 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 many years later?
Yeah, there's one that maybe is even more a little bit obscure that might not immediately come to mind. The games at the amphitheatres, they were very violent, and they set off a lot of emotions.
Sure.
It's a very chaotic crowd. And they were very much also associated with sex. And it was known that prostitutes would always go to the amphitheatres because it was a good market there. When the games finished, there was a good market.
Sure.
And that's where we get our word fornication from, because the word for an arch is a fornix. And that was where we wrote it. Yeah.
Who knew?
That's fornicate. That's so funny.
Mind is blown. I learned something. That's why I knew vomitorium, obviously, but I'm learning all kinds of good stuff today.
But vomitorium, I don't think it really means that everybody threw up in it. It means that
yes, no,
a lot of people going out.
Right. It means like an exit, right? Or
an exit. I mean, a crowd can exit.
I know. Yeah. I think that's a bit of a misconception is people associated with vomit and think, oh, that's where they went to vomit. It's like, no.
I'm sure some people did.
I'm sure people did.
I'm sure people did, right. But vomit, I'm sure, is just coming from the same root. It's exiting your body. You're exiting the amphitheater. Yeah.
Oh, actually, you've hit on something that probably wasn't such a pleasant aspect of the amphitheater, because there doesn't seem to be a lot of facilities for bathrooms.
I was going to ask.
There may well be quite a lot of things in those, those big corridors. So yeah, it was probably not a terribly hygienic place. It must have smelled terrible. I mean, it must have been awful. I mean, all those, sweaty people together, and then not much in the way of facilities. And of course, when they had wild animals in as well, it must have just been.
And you've got all this brutal stuff happening down there with
exactly.
blood and bodies.
Well, we do know that sometimes they used to sprinkle the crowd with scented water. So that might give us an indication as well.
That was like the pre-t-shirt cannon, they bring out now during games. Back then they were spraying perfume out. You get a little perfume, you get a little.
Oh, they also used to throw out little bags of fruit and things as well.
Oh, that's so fun.
Yeah.
So when we talk about, things that are at modern amphitheaters that are maybe, not in not something you would think about, but I find it fascinating. There were also been some remains of like things that showed that there were cups that were sold maybe with food and beverage. What were the concessions like for these early events?
Oh, definitely. There was a lot of food and drink going on there. There was a lot of sales as well. I mean, people would sell things there. Yeah, it was really a sort of day out. If you went to the amphitheatre, it was a kind of day out, It was pretty much a whole day experience. And so, there must have been merchandising must have been very, very important. And we know that they were big events. The amphitheatres that we have, which are all over the former Roman Empire, some of them, they're interesting because there's a kind of hierarchy of them. Some of them are quite just functional, small, and they probably were ones that, they were probably much more just the sort of local people and probably not a big deal. But then we have some that are very much bigger. And for example, as at Pompeii, these are on the edge of the town, right by the gate into the town. And that kind of implies that these ones are regional. So these are ones that serve the whole region. So they would, and we know as well from graffiti on the walls at Pompeii, that they had big competitions against local towns. So we have time when everybody came into Pompeii, it was a kind of regional center. And then there are the big, what we call the imperial ones, which is like the design at Capua, which is ones that were sponsored by the emperor in some way, were given some form of money, and they are supposed to really give back a little bit like what you were saying before. For that brief period of time, even if you were a slave and were stuck at the top, with the women, by the way, women had to go to the top of the arena with the slaves. Even if you were a slave for a kind of brief period of time, you could feel you were part of this empire. You had some rewards came back to you, And so it was something that was very important from the point of view of social cohesion, of sort of having everybody on the same side. I mean, much the same as today in venues, except that in venues today, I guess, well, maybe this wouldn't be true for the amphitheatre. You would get like teams supporting each other.
Sure.
So there's a kind of rivalry, right? That didn't really happen at the amphitheatre. It did happen very much at the circus, where there were horse racing.
Right.
That was when you get more of a sort of rivalry between teams. But when in the amphitheatre, really everybody who's a spectator is on the same team. And the people in the other team are the people in the arena who are, essentially being killed one way or another. Not the others. That's the other team.
And Capua has a kind of important history in that gladiatorial battles, right? Is it one of the original locations, or is it kind of where it escalated up to these larger crowds?
Yeah, it was a school. It was the most famous place for training gladiators. It had a sort of very famous school. Of course, famously, Spartacus was from there and led a rebellion. And indeed, there definitely were, particularly in these smaller provincial towns, people were a little bit nervous of the gladiators. Of course, you've got, highly trained killers.
Right.
So if they choose not to cooperate with you and sort of, work as a group, then you're in trouble. But I think sometimes we don't, the gladiators, particularly going further on into the empire, so that's the period that's, Common Era AD period, the gladiators they become what's called like homegrown. Initially, when gladiatorial competition in the Roman period started, they were prisoners of war. So they were kind of taken against their will. But then after Rome stops expanding, you have to have your own gladiators. And so they became less distinguishable from ordinary people in that way. And certainly, if you were a gladiator, for example, at Capua, right, you probably were, one of the best. And as such, you didn't, if you leave aside the fact that you had to keep going into the ring and sort of risk getting killed, in the other aspects of life, you didn't do so badly compared to a lot of people. We know they were very well fed, that they were looked after, that they had doctors. They didn't all die in the arena immediately because it was expensive. Gladiators were expensive. And we know that from some of the contracts, because the contracts, when you wanted to hire a group of gladiators, if they got killed, you had to pay more because obviously they'd have to replace them. Most gladiators, probably at the top of their game, would not fight more than maybe 3 or 4 times a year, So it wasn't all kind of really awful. But of course, the problem is that you took this awful oath that said that you agreed to be kind of stabbed and killed and branded and burnt, and you would do it to others, and that was what set them apart. And it always set them apart. Some gladiators, because you could keep the prizes, the gladiators had prizes, you could keep the prize money. Right. A few of them became pretty rich.
Yeah. Imagine so, yeah.
Yeah. Not so many, but a few of them did. But no matter how rich they became or how glamorous, because they were often quite good looking as well, because they used to select them for being good looking, because it got proud. And so no matter, how well you did out of it, if you did manage to do well out of it, you always had what was called infamy. That is, you were always polluted. You could never run for public office, all kinds of things you could never do. And ironically, if you then, got to the top and retired and that, you could never actually watch a game at the Colosseum.
Oh, interesting.
Because you were too polluted as a person. So it's a kind of a funny thing, they're kind of sex symbols. Well, very much so, because, it's sort of well known that women used to lust after them and that. And of course, they were also much feted because the great thing about the gladiator contests, the amphitheatre had a whole series of different sorts of games in it throughout the day. So you would start with the wild animals, you would go on at lunchtime to the execution of prisoners, and then in the afternoon was the big show, was the gladiators. But the thing about the gladiators was you could bet on them. And people bet their entire life savings on a match. You couldn't bet on wild animals because you didn't know how they're going to, how they're going to behave. They were a bit unpredictable. So, people really did kind of follow them. And obviously, if they'd made you a fortune, you were their supporter.
It's not that undifferent than maybe not as brutal by any means, but like a boxing match or something, that you would see in an arena now, and you have boxers that people will bet on, and they'll, see they're really successful and kind of continue to, grow in infamy. I guess along those lines, you studying so many of these ancient venues and amphitheaters, has it kind of changed your perspective when you go to a sporting event, or when you go to you kind of know some of the roots of these giant structures? If you go to a soccer match or a football match rather, or even a concert or something, does it sort of change your perspective when you go there, where you kind of can't help but think of some of the roots of everything?
I am a little bit more, it does make me nervous sometimes, because the thing is, people in a crowd, they don't behave like individuals do. They can start to behave in very different ways.
Sure.
And I do find that a little bit disconcerting, that people can kind of lose their humanity if they're not careful in such situations. We don't have very many accounts, actually, of how people felt at the amphitheatre. Funnily enough, we have a lot of material evidence for it, but we don't have much written about it, just like a few phrases written by philosophers and early Christians and some Roman writers. But all of them focus on not on the impact on the victims. They don't really seem to care very much about that, to be honest. But they focus on what it does to the crowd.
Yeah.
On how it can change you as a person, to you lose your humanity.
Sure.
And that, I think, is very true. I think that is very true. If you're not careful, that's what can happen. Yeah.
Let's talk for a minute about what happened to these buildings after the fall of the Roman Empire. Were they used for anything? What became of them? What's kind of the story after?
Well, yeah, because they're very sturdy buildings, actually. So they remained. So usually they were robbed of everything that you could rob from them, and then they were often used as, like, for example, the Colosseum was used as accommodation. So it's like a sort of bit of a condominium. So in the arches, there was settlements. People built like little houses in each of the arches, and there was like one row on the outside and then one on the inside as well. So it was kind of like a horizontal apartment block, if you like. And then we know as well that they often were used for industrial purposes. So, but we were very lucky. A few years back, our university was able to collaborate with Roman University, and we excavated part of the outer part of the Colosseum. And we found that there were places, for example, that they used to melt down the marble. So if you burn marble, you get lime, which is a very useful commodity for people in the medieval period when they wanted to like sterilize their town. So we also found a lot of horse paraphernalia as well, actually, and then various workshops and things. So people just use them. That's always what they've done with Roman buildings. They kind of squat in them and use them for different things, all kinds of different things. Sometimes some of them were taken over as churches as well. Some of them were used as burial grounds. So they just get used by people in the local community.
When have there been more of this historical preservation element? Has that been within the last couple hundred years, or where it's really kind of changed to being like, we need to preserve them, we need to study them a bit further, and less of kind of using them more of like utilitarian buildings?
Well, I suppose it kind of began in the 19th century, because that was when the kind of nation states of Europe were formed, more or less. And so they wanted national monuments. And in order to have a national monument, they had to like throw out all the people who were living in there. We've got some horrific accounts of people living in the Colosseum, actually, when they went in to like remove them so they could turn it into a monument. People living in absolute squalor in there. It's really quite heart-rending. So yeah, that was when it began. But I would say that one of the things that's quite interesting is it's only really in the last couple of decades that people have really started to think about what this was that happened in the Colosseum. Because for a long time, people who studied Roman history, Roman archaeology, the classics. They wanted to see them as very elevated people. They wanted to read the Latin texts and see, and they really didn't like what went on at the amphitheatres.
Right.
It was a bit of a similar situation to the Bath buildings as well. People didn't really want to know about what went on at Bath buildings. They didn't, they just didn't like that. They were happy to study the theatres.
Right.
So theatres,
yes, right, I get that. Yeah.
Focus on the more glamorous things and kind of try to gloss over the less pretty things. Yeah.
It just didn't correspond with how they saw the Romans, which they like to think of them as some sort of cultured, as though the whole of Romans were like university professors, which they obviously weren't. And I think, we need to come to terms with things like what went on at the amphitheatres, because It can teach us a lot. It teaches us a lot.
Absolutely, and I'm absolutely fascinated by this. So, what is it, if someone comes to visit today? Is it something that's open to visitors? So, what's the current status?
Yeah. Well, most towns really want to open their amphitheatres to visitors because they need the money. So, you usually find that pretty easy. Big places like the Colosseum now, they've got timed entries because they've got so many people wanting to visit. I think they're more or less back up to pre-COVID now. And pre-COVID, they got between 6 and 7 million visitors a year, which actually is more than the building can really stand,
Right.
So you may have read sometime in the press that, they get very frustrated with visitors who keep carving things into the fabric and things. So that's very annoying. Other places like Capua, you can visit if you go to Capua, and I do recommend it because it's very beautiful. You probably won't see a whole heap of other people there. And they will certainly like you to come. And of course, sometimes, they let themselves out as venues today. There is actually a small stage inside the Colosseum in Rome. It's not that big, to be honest, covering just a part of the arena. And sometimes they have concerts there, but they do it quite a lot just outside. And I do believe they're actually doing one this summer. I think I read that it's Russell Crowe with his band going to perform
How
there.
appropriate.
Somehow that makes sense.
Right.
So they do, of course, very famously in Verona, in northern Italy. The amphitheatre is used for the opera. The opera in Verona is very, very famous. But I think they've had to do quite a bit of work, to make it safe for everyone. So, it's quite problematical using these buildings for modern, you have to do quite a lot of work to make it, safe for everyone. And not infrequently that ends up damaging the fabric of it. So, but some places do it, and I know they do it in other places as well. I believe in the big amphitheatres. France has got some really big amphitheatres, Roman amphitheatres that they use.
What are the things that kind of get you the most excited about do you have your favorite little elements with the building? You're studying all of this stuff, but what's kind of your favorite little facts or little things that you just really love about whether it's the amphitheater, Capua, or something similar?
I do like going down below what's called the hypogeum, which is underneath the arena floor, right? Because they used to put on very spectacular shows. I think most people don't realize how spectacular they were. So a day at the amphitheater would begin in the morning with wild animals, right? And it would sometimes be animals against animals or animals against people,
right.
But they didn't just put in the arena a person and an animal. They would create a scenery. So they would create this kind of background, this backdrop, And they could even have a little stream running through it or little hills. And then they also had lifts. So they could bring the animal up right into the center of the arena, so you're watching it, suddenly this lion would leap out. So in the morning there was that. At lunchtime there was the execution of prisoners, and then in the afternoon there were the gladiators. The gladiators also might come up in lifts into the arena. So one of the things I really love is looking underneath the hypogeum, in what's called the hypogeum, because you can start to get some indication of how they did this.
Yeah.
They've got to kind of like reconstruct it.
Yeah, the logistics. Yeah.
Yeah, how they did the lift system and things. And actually, and I think you can see this on YouTube, a couple of years, well, it was actually whilst we were digging at the Colosseum that the National Geographic, I think it was, paid for a reconstruction of one of the lifts.
Oh, interesting.
Which is actually still there in the Colosseum. Of how they did it and how they got the animal into the arena. And they did it with this really beautiful wolf, I have to say. It's a really stunning animal, and showed how this happened. And so I love that kind of thing. One of the things that's fascinating as well is you can see the evolution of this, because these games, the problem is that as with all sorts of games, you've always got to go one better, right? So
right.
If the last time they had 20 lions, you've got to have 40 lions or something. You've got to do something more spectacular in order to have the same impact on the crowd. And you can actually see that underneath in the hypogeum, because you can see them remodeling it. So like one of the things that they do is sometimes they have to put another row of bricks underneath an archway. And that's clearly because they're putting really heavy scenery on top and it's not strong enough, And then they put in a ramp, and you can see they've had to cut through everything in order to have this ramp. At one stage in the Colosseum, they had this ramp, which was like a third of the width of the arena, that they lowered down. And it seems to be too steep for even an animal or certainly a man to walk up. So we think that it was just actually for cleaning the arena.
Yeah, just brushing everything down and yeah.
Because the crowd were very impatient. And the changing of scenery.
Crowds are still impatient like that now.
Yeah, that's right. They didn't like it.
Between an opening act and a headliner at a concert, they're like, right, where are they?
That's exactly right. So they had to make that part of the show.
Yeah.
The changing of scenery had to be part of the show. And it had to be quick and slick. And you can tell a lot of that by studying, the architectural fabric underneath the arena.
Well, before we let you go, I have to ask, how did you get into this? Where did your personal interest come from?
Well, I studied archaeology. I always wanted to study archaeology, so that was something I had, an infection from my youth. And I went to university, and then for a while afterwards, I actually worked as an archaeologist for the local government in Britain. And then I went back to university to do a PhD, and I ended up back in Italy. And that was where I did my PhD. So I just gradually got more and more into looking at this kind of thing. In particular, I really veered away from looking at pots or something like that. I like to look at like bigger picture and social attitudes and things. I find that more fascinating. So I was just lucky, really.
And you've got a little event experience in your background, you were telling us.
Yeah, I have some actually. When I was a grad student in New Zealand, I actually worked events. And I worked for Disney for a while, and then I worked at a big tent that did rock concerts. Also, interestingly had a circus there, which I don't think they do these days with animals. That was quite interesting to sort of see the animals there. I don't think I'd do that today, but it was kind of interesting. I liked it. It was
a rock and roll tent. I love that. There's all kinds of venues, right?
Well, of course, I was doing my grad work in New Zealand, which is quite a small country. So at that stage, they didn't have a whole load of venues. They have more now. And in fact, when I was there, I also worked in a theatre as part of this same group, a really lovely old theatre, which was pulled down, in fact, and was made into what is now the big event centre in the middle of Auckland. So that happened when I was there, and that was a bit sad to see that go. But it was great because the big tent that they had was actually pitched next to the airport. So the idea being that people could fly in, literally, they could fly in from the South Island and even from some of the islands in the Pacific, because it's really tough on those guys down there to get big events. Sure. They're small countries and it's not easy for them to get a really big show going there. So it was good fun.
Well, I really appreciate the time today. I always imagined a trip to Italy would include a trip to a visit to the Colosseum, but there's so much more out there. And I'm really, really glad you opened up our eyes to that.
Yeah. No, do go and see some of these smaller centers. Also, because nowadays, to be honest, if you're going to Italy, if any of your listeners are going to Italy, I have to tell you that if you're going to the big sites, Rome, Florence, Venice, you have to book in advance these days. They have time tickets for almost everything. So don't think that you can just go along and pitch up, because it's rarely the case. But you only have to go a little bit off the beaten track, and you will go to a place that's spectacular and which there'll be very few people, and it'll be a completely different experience for you. So I recommend you be adventurous.
Yes, absolutely. Anything you want to plug, any websites or anything that we should throw out there for you?
Well, I'd like to plug my university and my program.
Yeah, please do. Please.
The American University of Rome, and I actually do teach a course on heritage tourism, which the students taking travel tourism take. So I do, in fact, have some students from the business school who also take the heritage tourism course. So we enjoy doing that, and we actually do, at the American University of Rome, we do try to come up with a nice compromise between things like having heritage and having historical sites, but opening them up to everybody and making them part of modern society. This is what we want to do. So this is something we're very proud of. So if any of your listeners want to come and sample our wares, just go to the American University of Rome website.
Wonderful. And on that note, thank you so much. It was a real pleasure talking with you across a few different time zones.
Pleasure's all mine.
A big thanks to everybody for listening to this special episode of Adventures in Venueland. Remember, you can subscribe and find more episodes wherever you find your favorite podcasts. We do love your 5-star reviews because it helps others find us. Until the next ancient venue or adventure anywhere, I'm Dave Rettelberger.
And I'm Paul Hooper. Thanks for listening, everyone. Adventures in Venueland is a side project of the Event and Venue Marketing Conference, a marketing conference that brings together diversified event and venue professionals to cultivate education, collaboration, and innovation for the growing sports and live entertainment industry. Find out more at eventvenuemarketing.com.
Audio editing and mixing by Camille Faulkner.
Design and digital advertising by Megan Ebeck.
Copywriting and publicity by Samantha Marker.
Guest booking and brand strategies by Paul Hooper.
Guest research by Dave Rettelberger.
Marketing strategies by Paul Hooper, Megan Ebeck, and Samantha Marker. Thanks for joining us. Until the next adventure.